Tonight we're in Darlington, and welcome to Question Time. And with us here tonight, a former banker and advisor to George Osborne, now the government's energy minister, Claire Perry. A human rights lawyer before going into politics and Jeremy Corbyn's occasional stand-in at Prime Minister's Questions, the shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry. Property developer, champion of academy schools, co-chair of the pro-Brexit pressure group Leave Means Leave, Richard Tice. Rachel Sylvester, political columnist on The Times, and a long-standing supporter of Manchester music and Manchester United, the broadcaster Terry Christian. Carry on the arguments that are happening here. Our first question, it comes tonight from Katie Woolsey, please.
Should female Tesco checkout staff who want to be paid the same as male warehouse staff apply for a transfer into the warehouse?
Right. Tesco, of course, who face, it's said, something like £4 billion bill for having paid women in one area less than men in another. Richard Tice, you're a businessman. What do you think?
Well, look, I mean, we had the Equal Pay Act in 1970, so we've got a fantastic start. But the reality is you've got to have equal pay for equal jobs. That has to be the basic understanding. If you start to try and compare the value of different jobs within the same organisation, then I think it becomes much more difficult. But it's always up for debate. We must always do better than what we're currently doing. It's a scandal that, having had that Equal Pay Act for over 40 years, that these issues are still around, whether it's in the BBC, Tesco's or other major multinational corporations. But
are you saying it's not possible to decide whether there's equal work to match equal pay?
It's clearly much easier to work out if you've got the same job and you've got a woman and a man, then that's very easy. If you're trying to value a warehouse job compared to someone working on the shop floor at the checkout, that actually is much harder. How do you value what it's worth to the business? Everybody's worth something to the business, but that's much harder.
Okay. Emily Thornberry.
I think time and time again, when you look at these jobs, the ones that are low paid are always the women's jobs. And that's how it is. And it drives me crazy. Barbara Castle introduced the Equal Pay Act in 1970. I bet she'd be turning in her grave to see that it's still going on and that women are still systematically paid less than men. The women who are working on the checkout at Tesco's are working just as long hours. They're just as important to Tesco's as those who work in the warehouse. It's just that they're the blokes, and the ones who are paid less, yet again, are the women. And, many of the jobs that are largely women's jobs, are the most valuable. So looking after your mum, you give it to social care workers, and they are usually women. And guess what? We pay them as little amount of money as we possibly can within the law. Or our precious 4-year-olds are looked after, again, largely by women and largely paid the least amount.
What about Tesco, which the question was about?
So I'm just saying that it's a coincidence, isn't it? It's more than a coincidence that it's the blokes in the warehouse who are getting paid more than the women on the checkouts, and it is because certain things are seen as women's work, and therefore, almost by definition, they're not seen as valuable. And yet, many of the work that women do are actually really valuable. Looking after a 4-year-old, why is that less valuable than being a banker or anything else? I mean, this is the way that our society is structured.
Well, you're arguing for equal pay for bankers and what I'm saying is that we need to 4-year-old children. I'm not following your argument. There
are largely 12 jobs that different workforces in which women go into, and they're very similar to the sort of work that women do at home. And time again, it is undervalued. So whether it's secretarial work, whether it's nursing, whether it's caring, whether it's teaching, all of these things tend to be women's work, and they tend to be underpaid. Okay. And we have to think about that.
You sit up there. Man with the spectacles there.
Having worked in one of the top supermarket chains, I've seen both the shop floor type of work and the warehouse type of work. And I can say for a fact, like, work on the shop floor, you you're speaking to the customers, it can be quite relaxed. While in the warehouse, it's noisy, it's loud, it's cold, it's hard graft. So I think trying to compare shop floor work to warehouse work, I think it's not the same.
I'm not saying it's the same. I'm not saying it's the same. It's different work, but it's just as valuable.
All right, the woman there in the
yeah,
centre.
but
OK, I got your point. You, madam.
I can see what Emily's saying, but you've got 2 jobs in Tesco's, so it should be 2 separate job scales. My take on the equality pay is more based on what's happened recently at the BBC. Why did the men feel that the only way they could step up for their women's colleagues was to take a pay cut? Yeah. Why did they not actually challenge their bosses to bring the women's pay in line with theirs for the same job role? It's 2 different job roles at Tesco's. It's not at the BBC.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot trickier.
Go on, then. Terry Christian.
I was going to say it's a lot trickier at Tesco's, and it's one for lawyers, and it is at the BBC, because, you know, if you think about John Humphreys, God bless him, harumphing about art and new technology while reading the editorial from the Daily Mail, then you've got to wonder, is he really worth 4 times what a female broadcaster does when she's doing exactly the same job as him? It's one for the lawyers at Tesco.
The woman here.
We're having the debate here because there is still women's work, that can be lower paid. But even when women and men do an equal job, there is still a gender pay gap. Iceland just made it illegal to pay a man more than a woman. Do the UK need to follow that example?
Claire Perry.
Look, it's 100 years since some women got the vote, and I still find it incredible that there are jobs out there, including at the BBC, where women are systematically paid less for doing exactly the same job as a man. And it is really good that the gender pay gap is at its lowest level. We've brought forward lots of proposals, so companies have to disclose what they're paying, and so does the public sector, and so does government. I think this is a complicated case, as the gentleman said, because there's nothing to stop women taking on those jobs. It'd be one to work with interest. But we've seen time and time again, we had the big cases in local government a few years ago, where women had to fight through the courts to get equal pay for the same jobs. It's got to stop. We have half the workforce now as women. We know we're going to be wanting to work for longer, and we have to make sure that we are giving women exactly the same pay and rights as some of us got with the vote 100 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in supermarkets as well, the women aren't unionised. Now, maybe if they were in a trade union, then they could collectively bargain and they would get that. And one of the problems, and, my mum used to always say this, one of the reasons that women are often paid less than men is they seemed very reluctant to join trade unions in the past. And even now, women are often, in jobs, decent jobs, will often do unpaid overtime because they may be a bit more conscientious than the blokes. But they shouldn't be doing it, really, because they're driving their own wages down and everybody else.
Let me go back to Katie Wolsey, who asked the question. What's your view?
I agree with the man over there. I think that if women want to go and work in the warehouse, go and apply for the job. Why should they get paid more? I wouldn't mind sitting on my behind all day, scanning stuff and chatting to people. I know that working in a warehouse, because I actually do work in a warehouse, by the way. I own my own business and I have a warehouse. And I was there today. It was freezing cold and it's dirty and it's dusty. I'd like to see the women apply for those jobs if they want the pay the same as the men.
Yeah. OK. Rachel Sylvester.
I think there is still a huge issue. There's an 18% gap on average between what men and women earn, and there are all kinds of reasons for that.
The same jobs.
Well, not for the same job, for the same job. But the problem with this is that it's about what society values. So society values less the caring roles, whether it's being a carer, a cleaner, a dinner lady, compared to what is seen as the strength and muscular roles. Yeah. And I think that's a big problem, and you can't get around that. And that's about social values as much as about employment law.
There's one other
Richard, I was just going to bring Richard Tyson. I'll come back to you.
So, what's particularly disappointing, we are one of the worst in Europe at this. It's almost only Germany that is worse than us. I think one of the ways, the government's got to be much more ambitious with its targets. I think the other thing is we need many more great women in senior roles in corporations, and then it's much less likely to happen. So that really has to be an objective.
OK. Well, Emily.
I was just going to say, we need a new Equal Pay Act. We need an updated Equal Pay Act that really addresses this issue. And I think one of the other issues that we need to also put into the melting pot, we're talking about this subject more generally, is when women start working part-time after they've had kids, or when they have caring responsibilities for elderly relatives, and then they're vulnerable, and then they are more likely to take the more lower-paid jobs, and they don't apply for promotion because they're so grateful to be able to work part-time more flexibly. And we have to start thinking about that as well, because we're losing a very large part of the workforce and we're not valuing them properly.
What do you say to Katie Wools's point, though, about warehouse and working indoors, that they're not equal?
I'm not saying that they're the same job; they're different jobs. But for Tesco's, to have people working on the cash points and to be talking to customers and to be the face of Tesco's is a very important job as well, and ought to be valued in the same way, in my view, as people working in the warehouse. Yes, of course, it's a different job. But why is it that we're valuing, as I say, blokes' jobs more than we're valuing women's jobs?
But nobody's stopping the women for applying for those jobs. That's what I'm saying. Nobody's stopping a woman going to work on a construction site. The truth is that women don't want to do them dirty jobs. They really don't want to do it.
And if there were more men, for example, doing childcare or doing caring for the elderly, I bet those salaries would go up. I bet they would.
Maybe.
I'm sorry, but what about people that can't physically work in warehouses? Why should they settle for a lower wage? It's an equal job, they're working the same hours. People that have disabilities and so forth, they cannot apply for that job. And why is that seen as a dirty job? When things like nursing, they're looking at people in all sorts of conditions, they're working all sorts of hours, and they don't have the same equal pay and the same sort of, recognition amongst society.
All right. And the woman at the very back there.
Thank you. Can I just say, I worked for Asda for 2 years, just about 8 months ago. And I'm sorry, but what the lady over there about the warehouse, it's nothing but insulting coming from one woman to another woman. The people in Asda, I'm not quite sure how Tesco works. I worked in Asda. I worked on the shop floor, ambient, lugging things around, pulling things. I worked with with customers. I was a customer. I went on checkouts in emergencies. I also worked in the warehouse. I pulled orders. If need be, we split orders down.
Were you on an equal pay to the men?
We were on equal pay, but not to the people in the central warehouses, which is what I think is being discussed.
Right, OK.
But that's the case. Those people had an easier job. They just literally loaded everything on, and it was when it got to the stores that we had the harder work.
They should have been paid less, you're saying?
They should be paid the same as us.
Oh, the same
not
as
more.
You. All right, and the man up there, then I think we must move on. The man at the very back with spectacles on in the back row, on the right there, yes.
I always thought when people went for a job, they applied, they were interviewed, they knew what the job was about, and they knew what the pay was. So you're at liberty not to accept it. Where's the problem?
OK. I think we'd better go on. We've obviously raised a lot of questions. Right. Let's have a question from Natasha Telfer, please.
Is it fair that local authorities have to take the blame for having to increase council tax?
Is it fair local authorities have to take the blame for having to increase council tax? We heard that council tax, on average, is going up in almost every council in England. Scotland is different, of course, by 6%, or just under the 6% limit that they have to go to. Is it fair that councils should have to do this and because they're not getting money from government? Claire Perry.
I think one of the things I find is that people, the closer they see money being spent to them, the more they feel they're involved in those decisions. And one of the terrible things a few years ago when I first came into politics was only 30% of people thought they had any influence over the way any of the money was spent locally. And so actually, we know the incredible role that councils play in providing social care for services, children's services, picking up the rubbish, putting in the recycling bins or not. I think the more that money is spent closer to us, the more we feel it's delivering value or we have a chance to change it. So we all know we're going to have to change the way we fund social care. I know in Wiltshire where the council taxes are going up, people feel that it's reasonable. And in general, people are happier now with public services than they've been in many a year.
But so, hang on.
Well, they are. Look at the polls. People are happier. People say they are happier with the public services than they've been in a long time.
But why the question comes, the point of the question, why have you deliberately cut money from taxpayers to the councils by 40% since 2010 and put all the burden on the councils. That was the point of the question.
I was out today with your fantastic combined local authority.
Are you going to answer that question?
Who are working collectively on the T side, the SSI side, which is going to be absolutely amazing. And it was about, and there's a huge devolution deal behind that, almost £500 million over the next 30 years. I think that money coming out to local government, being spent locally, is the right thing to do.
But hang on, the question Natasha asks, is it fair local authorities have to take the blame? You know perfectly well what the issue is. Local councils have lost 40% of their money from central government, and they're lumbered with having to raise it from the rate from house
a whole
owners.
Series of settlements. We want to make sure that business rates, which are raised locally and historically go whistling back to Westminster, are actually kept and spent locally. To me, this is about changing the funding base, so it's actually more money is raised locally and spent locally.
Do you think it's fair, Rich?
No, I think the government's passing the buck to local councils, particularly on social care. Yep. There've been something like... There's been something like £6 billion cut from the social care budgets alone, and that's the reason for our NHS crisis now this winter. Yep. There are something like 1 in 10 beds in the NHS are now filled with people who are well to go home but can't do that because there's nowhere to look after them in the community. Care homes are closing, domiciliary care services can't cope. Councils have had to cut the amount of money they're paying to care homes, so the whole system's absolutely creaking. And I think that's a failure of leadership from Theresa May and the government not to take a national decision about a national crisis.
So you think taxes should go up to pay for these things?
I think there should be some kind of hypothecated health and social care tax. This isn't a situation that's
being money that's raised just for that job. Yes.
Not just for the NHS, but also for social care. This isn't something that's to do with NHS efficiency.
Why do you think they won't do this?
It's to do with the ageing population.
Why won't the government act on this?
Well, I think Jeremy Hunt would quite like to do it, actually. There's cross-party support. I've talked to Labour MPs, Tory MPs and Liberal Democrat MPs, all think this is a really good idea. All acknowledge there's a huge crisis. All acknowledge that actually you can't put this onto local councils alone anymore, as Natasha says. And I think it's time now for the government to act.
A lot of it goes back to Thatcher, because she was the first one, you know, funny enough, to start bringing the money back in from the local councils and then rate capping those councils. Now, the Tories have always been the party of indirect taxation. So they would always tax in a way where you couldn't blame them directly. You know, back in the old days when we had a nationalised gas and electricity and water and stuff like that, if your water or your gas bill went up, you blamed the government or you blamed your local council directly. Once you've privatised it, you take that away. And so it's like, oh, it's nothing to do with us. And this is the problem now with libraries shutting down. Everywhere's creaking because the whole country is in a mess. And to use a quite vacuous statement, which is used a lot nowadays, I think it's what they say. No deal is better than a bad deal. I'd say no leader is better than a bad leader. And at the moment, we've got no leadership in this country. We've got no government.
Richard,
let's stick to the question.
I've just stuck to the question. We're getting the cuts.
As taxpayers, we all want the money. We all want our taxes to be spent well, whether it's at central government or whether it's local authority. And coming back to Natasha's question, clearly local authorities can't absolve themselves for spending that money wisely. We want it to be spent well, efficiently and smartly. So there is, of course, there's always pressure on budgets. There always will be, but they can't absolve themselves of that blame. They've got responsibilities at the local level. They need to spend the money well.
But when it comes to caring for people, that's expensive. And that's got to be taken into account. So local budgets and the expenses going up, and it's all coming down on the NHS.
All right, I come to Emily Thornby in a moment. I'll go to the man over there in spectacles. Let's just hear from one or two people who have to foot these bills. Yes. The woman there, yes.
In addition to adult social care, there is also a massive problem in children's social care that we don't talk about nearly enough. They're the most vulnerable children in our society. The Local Government Association says that by 2020, I believe there's going to be a £2 billion national deficit in this area, and we are seeing such an increase in demand in the North East because children and young people are being brought into care through neglect in this age of austerity.
And is it your view that... as Terry was saying, is it your view this is deliberate action by the government to put the burden onto local councils?
I do, and I think it's particularly targeted at Labour authorities in the North East. We've had the worst cuts, and we're the ones who have the biggest, not quite burdens, but we have a lot more demand in terms of social care and fewer people who can foot their own bills.
All right, I'll give Claire a chance to answer that. Emily Thornberry. Emily Thornberry.
Do you want me to speak?
What? Yes.
Okay.
If you want to speak.
I would love to speak. I have a lot to say.
I've never known you not want to speak.
I have a lot to say on this.
Well,
you're right.
Let's stick to the question
although the average cuts, so in the end, right, local authorities' major income comes from central government, and that is a truth. And to put up council tax will never make up for the amount that councils are losing centrally from government. And on average, it's 40% cuts, but you're absolutely right. Guess what? The poorest areas are the ones that are getting the biggest cuts. So you're not alone in the North East. Deprived inner-city boroughs like mine, we've got 60% cuts in my area, where I have some of the worst child poverty in the country. So what they're doing is that they're cutting back the fund centrally, and then what they do is they decentralise the blame. So that they cut their money from central government, and then local people say, what's happened to our bin service? Why are our streets so dirty? What is going on? And they blame the councillors. But actually, it's central government, and it is being done deliberately, and the chickens are coming home to roost. That is what's happening. And we know that the people who really suffer are those who are the most vulnerable, because councils absolutely have to look after children who are on the verge of going into care, and they don't have enough money. And councils have been telling this government, pleading with this government, councils of every stripe, and they just have cloth ears on this and will not listen.
All right.
And as for social care...
OK, I think the moment's made. It's a pretty severe indictment, Claire Perry. What do you say?
I admire her passion, but she's just wrong. And here's why. So we talk about wanting to fund better our NHS, our social care, our vulnerable children's services. And there are two ways, as you know, madam, because it sounds like you're a local government expert, to fund this. We can either increase borrowing, or we can put up taxes, or we can cut costs. And I think councils have cut costs very effectively across the country over the last few years. People have done an amazing job and found lots of efficiencies.
Well,
so we have a choice. Do we put up taxes? Yes, a round of applause for you, I think. Do we put up taxes nationally? And we put it all into the mix, and this interesting question about do you ring fence it, which of course is what national insurance was originally supposed to be, or do you raise taxes locally where people can see what they're being spent on? And when I talk to my constituents in Devizes, delivering better social care is not some amorphous pot coming out of central government. It's joining up the GP surgeries so that the frail elderly get visits, get home visits, they get kept out of hospital. It's working with the local hospital. I think so much of the solution for social care is better integration of health and social care.
And
I think
money,
it's better
Claire.
done locally.
You can't keep doing it on money.
But hang on.
People's goodwill.
Claire, just answer this question. Yeah. Isn't it true, though, that if you say the local authorities it's better if they get the money locally and fund it, you stop them raising the money they get by limiting it at 6%. You don't let them. You don't let them raise the money that they might need to do this.
But when I meet people increasingly, people say, I'd be happy to pay a bit more for the NHS and for social care, and this is a contribution that we're making locally. What we know from Emily's team, and I don't like to get partisan, but sometimes the cloth ears is a little nasty. You know, one of Emily's frontbench spokespeople had to resign after exposing the plan to jack up council taxes, to jack up national income taxes, and just spend more on everything. We have to make these choices. I think putting money into social care and vulnerable children is a really good justification for raising taxes. Well, the councils will do it, Terry, because they're raising...
It's a cynical exercise in blame pushing. You know it is. You don't believe a word of what you're saying. You do not believe a word of it.
OK. Whether she believes what she's saying or not, let's go to members of our audience just to hear what they think of what she's saying. The woman in the 1, 2, 3... Yes, you in the grey.
So you talk about integration being the solution, but privatisation of the NHS is such a cause of disintegration of services. Services can't work with one another. It's becoming so much, it's much poorly executed than it ever was.
That's just not true, madam. I'm really sorry to come back on this. So when we talk about privatisation, we think about somehow charging people to visit local hospitals, For decades, we have had independent
No, we
providers.
don't. When we think about privatisation, we think about public money going into private.
Let me try and shout down, Emily. People hate seeing politicians doing that.
You're talking
about in this area, in my area. We can exchange insults or we can talk about the facts. So the facts are, in my constituency and in this one, there are independent providers of services providing services free for the NHS. Things run by Care International. Macmillan Nurses is an independent provider. That started under Tony Blair. It's continued because actually we shouldn't have ideology in the health service. We should protect it and make it free at the point of demand for everybody who needs it. Stop the ideology and focus on facts.
Claire, the question is not about that. It's about local authorities, about the increase in the rates.
I was responding to the point
yes, I know
about
you were.
privatisation.
The man there in the third row.
Yes, how about instead of cutting budgets and forcing local councils all over the country to put their taxes up, how about you cut the foreign aid budget and then that money could go towards other things that are needed in this country?
Okay, and don't say every point that's made.
Don't sit there shaking your head.
All right, we got your point.
It's a sensible solution.
Fine, let's hear the man. No, let's hear from the man at the very back there, up there.
I think you just need to look at, rather than what's coming in, is what's going out. And when you look at this local authority here, generally the net spend has been pretty consistent during this period of austerity. If you look at also, it's the fact that councils have an obligation to carry out a statutory or provide a statutory service. Now, this council here again spends on non-statutory services, and that's fine as long as they're breaking even. But when they're costing a lot, we need to look at what we're actually spending our money on, not what's coming in.
Are you saying that they're spending money they didn't need to spend?
They're spending money on non-statutory services, which are making a loss.
Like what?
The Dolphin Centre.
But it's great.
Would it be
This is where we're sitting.
It would be absolutely peanuts.
Well, no, this is actually Central Hall. The Dolphin Centre is next door.
But the swimming pool and all that, where we've been all day, not swimming, but getting ready for this programme. You think that shouldn't be funded by the council?
And you also, come back to what's coming in, the Labour government, over the period of the Labour government, council tax increased by 100%. Now, during this period of austerity, council tax generally is only increased by around about 15%. So you've got a significant imbalance there.
But who would you like to have pay for the swimming pool?
I think it should be private.
Okay.
So, somebody who basically makes a profit.
Okay. And you in the second row here, the one here.
I work in healthcare in a senior role. There's a reality about we do need to do more. We do need to integrate services. We are working very closely with our GP, primary care services. We're doing everything we can in that. But the absolute reality is there isn't enough funding to go around. And non-statutory services include services for very old, very frail people. And how would you feel if your very old, very frail, elderly mum was actually in need and wasn't able to access the services that are required and then would need, despite all of the work around integration, because they don't get the care that they need, they end up in hospital and stuck there.
Remember, a woman there, sorry. Yes.
The fact is that the National Audit Office have produced a report to say that private finance supporting statutory or non-statutory services is an inefficient way to support what we really need in this country. So I don't agree with that gentleman up there that said that we should privatise places such as this Dolphin Centre. I think it's a totally ridiculous statement.
I just wanted to go back to the original question and question what Claire was saying, because actually councils, it's the least fair way of raising money for social care, because the richest councils, by definition, can raise the most from council tax. And it's the poorest councils that have to pay the most for social care, because they have the fewest people who can afford to pay for their own care. So it's the imbalance. That's why it has to be a national system.
That's right. Do you want to come in on this?
Well, I think the point is it is all about choices, and the gentleman raised the question of the foreign aid budget. We know we've got a huge crisis in social care, and as a nation, we have to make that choice, because money doesn't grow on trees. We've got to make public services well-funded, but they've got to be efficiently run. But, you know, it is about choices.
And the government has to have the courage to make that choice.
Terry would love to print money. You can't just print money.
You've got no choice if you need social care.
Correct.
Right? So if you are homeless, you've got no choice. If you are terminally ill and you need a carer, you've got no choice.
And
if you are disabled, you have no choice. So all of this nonsense about you've got a choice, of course you haven't. Get into the real world.
All right. The government's got to make a choice. Okay. Where does it invest the money?
Short term, because what you save in the short term ends up costing you more in the long term.
We've got many more questions that our audience here in Darlington want to ask. So I want to move on to another one. So I've got 2 or 3 more I'd like to get through, and we're halfway through the programme. But let's have this one from Helene Lawson, please.
Should John Venables continue to have anonymity at the taxpayer's expense?
John Venables, who was this week found guilty of possessing child abuse images for the 2nd time, jailed for 3 years. And there was a question raised about whether he was entitled to be given anonymity. Rachel Sylvester, what do you think?
This is just an awful, sickening case. But I worry about removing anonymity from him because I think there could be a real kind of mob mentality about him. And I'm not sure it would actually help society in the end or protect anyone. And I think the criminal justice system, however evil people are or vile, the criminal justice system has to be fair and even-handed and dispassionate. And there are people who aren't going to agree with that. I totally understand why James Bulger's family feel very passionately about this. But I think you can't have a criminal justice system that's really made for victims. It has to be at a higher level. And it has to be even-handed and fair rather than vindictive or vengeful.
Helen, do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. Yes.
You do agree with that? All right. Terry Christian.
I mean, again, I agree really with what Rachel said. You know, the whole thing is very sad and sickening, you know, and especially when you think they were so young when they committed that atrocious crime. But it's like, you know, where do we go? You know, I think it was in 1842 when we decided we'd no longer hang kids under the age of 7 or something like that, you know, and it's like, how much punishment can you give them? And you've got to wonder what sort of upbringing they had to turn out the way they did.
Mm.
You know, it's scary.
I mean, clearly you have to treat people equally and fairly. You can't make sort of special, separate cases for different people just because you think it's ever more desperate. You know, we've got such a great legal system, but you have to treat people fairly and you can't differentiate.
Well, his anonymity, which was imposed after the case, because he was a child at the time, should remain all his life.
I think it should just be applied the same for everybody, whoever you are.
How do you mean, whoever you are?
Well, I mean, we can't make different rules for different individuals going through the system of whatever age they are.
I see. The woman in the back there, what do you think?
Yeah, what I'd say is I think anonymity is really important for that sort of thing because social media, like look, when Shannon Matthews' mother, Karen Matthews, came out all over the papers, all over Facebook, social media of her face, and I just think it would just promote vigilante groups to go around following them. It could encourage like violent attacks and things like that. What he did was disgusting, and you can't, he was a child then, but now continually doing disgusting things. But if you remove the anonymity, you're just going to encourage vigilante attacks.
Okay. Does anybody disagree with the points that are being made, that wants to speak? You do.
This guy's done a terrible crime when he was young. And he paid for it. He came out and he did the same thing again.
Well, not quite.
Well, he did bad things on the internet. So how do we protect ourselves from this individual? Because we're not putting him in prison long enough. People don't know where he is. He could be doing it again. So I don't think we're safe without knowing exactly where he is.
Well, Emily Thornberry.
I mean, I agree with you to a certain extent when you talk about us having a great legal system, but we don't have a great justice system as a whole. And I think that there's a lot of work that we're letting go and a lot of things that we used to do better and we're not doing as well now. In order to keep us safe, sir, we need to not only punish people and keep them out of the public sphere, but we also have to do some work on rehabilitation. And we have to have a decent system that when people leave prison, that there is some attempt to a probation service that is there as a safety net in order to ensure that people are, doing the best they can to get back into society and to keep on the right side of the law. And
We've done that. We've given him the chance, but he's blown it again.
I understand that, but there's a real problem in terms of protecting our society about making sure that people are rehabilitated. Because you can't just, if someone commits a crime, you can't lock everybody up forever until they go.
But the point is, sorry, let's get this clear.
Again.
This is the second time he's been arrested and in prison for these offences. What he's saying is that allowed to go on all his life, that he'll never ever be revealed who he is, that it's a condition that he'll remain anonymous?
I think, as people know, I mean, the crimes that he's committed now are serious, but obviously nothing is as serious as the original crime he committed as a child. And the difficulty is that if his anonymity is got rid of, he will be at risk of losing his life.
OK. Does anybody else want to disagree with the points that have been made on the panel? I'll come to you, Claire. You at the very back there, yes.
I personally believe, obviously, the initial crime was horrendous. I still remember watching on the news. You couldn't imagine somebody that young actually doing something like that. Now, you've both mentioned we've got a great justice system. How about we set a precedent and say, right, you do it again, I see you in my courtroom again, you're losing your anonymity.
All right, OK, Claire Perry.
Put the ball back in the net. Let's see if he can actually be rehabilitated.
I mean, no, I think those images are seared in everybody's memory of that little lad going off in Bootle. And actually, the only positive thing, if you like, that came out of that was that it appeared that these young men, who must have had the most unbearable upbringings to do those sorts of crimes, appeared to have gone through the system and it had worked. They had achieved a level of competence, they were able to function. And the only thing I would say is the system is actually working. So he's coming out, they obviously know where he is and what he's doing. They're finding the fact that he is consuming this vile imagery and he's breaching the terms of his licence and going back to jail. I'm not suggesting that isn't a cycle that should continue forever, but I don't think revealing his name does anything to make the chances of him doing that any less. The bigger problem actually, sir, if I may, the other big problem is the fact how easy it is to access that sort of sickening stuff on the internet, and the work that we've done over the years cross-party to try and tighten up this system so you can't find that stuff is hugely helpful.
The woman here, and then we'll move on. Yes, the woman there.
Where's the fairness for the Bulger family that are forced to relive this every time this happens?
Well, that is...
And so what's your answer to that?
I don't think we should be forced to. I think that there should be a lot more research done into the person while they're serving inside to find out whether they're safe to be released.
OK. Yes, the woman there in the middle.
I think his name doesn't help.
There was 2 children that was involved in that crime. Robert Thompson served his time. Robert Thompson came out. Robert Thompson was given anonymity. Nobody knows where he is, what he's doing. Same with Mary Bell. They were given their opportunity. They rehabilitated and they came out. This other gentleman hasn't. Yeah. And where do you draw the line and allow him to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it? I totally agree with the fellow at the back. One more chance, you've blown it, your anonymity's gone. Because where's the protection for my children or my grandchildren? And as that lady said, where's the justice for the Bulger family?
All right. Right, now, we're moving on to another subject. I have just to say to people watching this programme that I asked this audience whether they wanted this subject discussed this week, and I have to say 75% of them said they didn't want it discussed. And yet the biggest pile of questions we had was on this very subject. So I don't know where you're coming from, and I hope people at home will forgive us, because this story moves on week by week. Let's have this one. It comes from Stuart Armstrong. It's very pertinent to where we're sitting here in Darlington.
Would 16% lower economic growth in the North East be a price worth paying for a hard Brexit?
So, Richard Tice wants a hard Brexit, and the report came out this week.
Hang on, David. I want a clean, proper Brexit.
All right,
let's be very clear.
Clean, proper Brexit, whatever you like to call it. I don't know whether it's a hard one or soft one. All right, well, you'll explain it. But the report came out this week saying that growth in the North East would fall by 16% if there were a hard Brexit.
Look, the reality is about this, and with economic forecasts, particularly forecasts for 15 years out, you know, garbage in equals garbage out with these economic models. These models were produced by the same people who, during the referendum campaign at the Treasury and the civil servants, they said that within a year we'd be in deep recession, we'd lose 500,000 jobs, the tech firms would leave, the banks would leave. What a load of absolute rubbish. We've got 400,000 more people employed in this country. We've got record low levels of unemployment. We've got so much to celebrate. And the great thing is, the opportunity is just beginning. And here locally, near to Darlington, down at Teesport, there's a wonderful opportunity as long as we leave the customs union, because that's crucial. We can then have a free port. And free ports generate thousands and thousands of manufacturing jobs, as your local Richmond MP recently proved. And that's a wonderful opportunity, because we need to rebalance the economy towards more manufacturing jobs in, less well-off areas.
Hang on a second. You dispute the facts, but if it led to a 16% drop in the growth in this part of the country, would it be worth it? That was the question.
That was the question.
I mean, you're a great believer in leaving.
It's completely hypothetical, and we all know,
I know it's
these people, they can't even forecast 1 year. They can't even forecast 1 year in advance, let alone 15.
Well, you're not going to answer it. I mean, to be honest with you, the minute they say things are going to be bad, right? The Brexiters always say, oh, that's rubbish. The minute it's gone up a little bit, they say, oh, look, you've exaggerated how bad it's going to be.
But the proof is in the pudding.
Reality
We've been proved right.
Well, listen, I saw you in 2015 saying, Brexit, leaving the EU is simple. Everything's simple when you're a bit simple.
All right, Claire Perry.
No, the reality is a 16% drop over here, it's going to cost you something ridiculous, like, is it 1 in 6 jobs? The actual Great Recession of the 1930s was a 15% drop. When you're saying rubbish, you're saying rubbish, good luck with that one. Come and tell me how you're getting on in a few years' time or 16 months' time, because you seem to be very, very hopeful. I don't see any upside to it. So far, the pound's tanked by 15%. Is that a good sign that things are getting better?
In 15 years' time, you come
and
join the celebration.
We've got the lowest growth in the EU.
You come and join the celebration when we've got more manufacturing jobs in the North East. We've got 3 ports. We've rebalanced the economy.
Based on what? Based on what findings?
Okay.
Is it based on that economist, Patrick Minford?
All right, let's
the one who said there was a minimum wage.
It's getting boring. You're getting boring. Boring. I can see why people, if we're going to have arguments conducted like this, I can see why people get bored of the argument.
He needs to give his head a wobble.
Yeah, OK. Claire Perry, you famously said that some of your MPs were representing... What?
I did not.
What did you not say? I haven't even spoken.
I do hate the way BBC likes to do this fake news. By the way, this men shouting at each other, it's a bit like Parliament.
What did you not say?
We need more of you in Parliament.
Just tell me what you did not say.
Shouting at for lying to people.
Let's answer the question. Can I answer the question?
No, tell me what you didn't say.
What I didn't say was that anyone who voted Brexit was in any way to have their views discounted, because we went through the biggest democratic exercise this country has ever seen. And Emily and I were on one side of the debate, probably with you, Terry, and Richard was on the other. And you know what? We said we'd respect the result of the referendum. We said we would deliver what the people wanted, and the people voted for Brexit.
Hang on, but on my ballot paper, it didn't say anything about leaving the single market,
it's just like
leaving
Parliament,
the customs
ladies,
union,
the blokes trying to shout the ladies down.
No, I'm telling you what wasn't on my ballot paper.
OK,
so
Terry,
my ballot paper leave or remain.
Terry, please.
So, to go to...
Wait a second, Claire. Terry, please, let Claire speak, will you?
So to go to the question, this question of is it worth it? So I don't recognise those numbers because they relate to the sort of off-the-shelf deals that are out there.
Well,
what we've said
is... Terry,
honestly,
please don't interrupt her. Let her have her say.
15-year-old Terry. It's
Democratic...
I'm just helping her.
Parliament... No, you're not helping at all.
You're being really rude, actually.
Well, no, I'm just helping her.
OK.
And look, whenever you go through a divorce, you set off with a set of negotiation objectives, and then you negotiate. And this is, I think it's right. Actually, we have the best civil service in the world. I think it's right that we look at the numbers. We understand where we don't want to go, which is to reduce the growth in the economy. But can I just say for the North East, those numbers don't include a couple of things. They don't include the Sirius project that will add 20% to the Teesside economy. They don't include the regeneration potential from that amazing SSI site that companies are queuing up to invest in. So this is a work worst case scenario. And frankly, if we want to, and I say this as a Remainer because we have to accept the result and we can work together. It's the time for the country to put aside all this shouting over the referendum and work together on this historic task, which we know we can do, and we can deliver a better place and better growth and a global Britain.
So why in that case do you accuse... Why in that case do you accuse some of your colleagues on the backbenches?
I did not do this.
I haven't said it yet.
I know what you're going to say.
What?
You're going to say...
Swivel-eyed.
No,
They're representing swivel-eyed constituents,
no,
you said.
I said in a private group, one of the problems with social media is things leak. That's a lesson for all of us. What I said is I hate extremism in any form. And people who are shouting about my colleagues, all of whom swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen, and calling them quislings and traitors for expressing their views in Parliament, I think that language is disgraceful.
Okay.
And I think the people that say that, and they're not people who chose to vote to leave the EU, these are extremist voices, and there are too many extremist voices, frankly, on both sides of the debate. Frankly, often gentlemen shouting really loudly.
I'm not being extreme.
And we want to get together in the middle and deliver this scheme.
No, you can't. Rachel Sylvester.
Nissan.
No, you just sit quiet and wait.
Rachel Sylvester, I'll come back to you. The new model to be
and women can sometimes keep talking too. Rachel Sylvester, please.
I think this question goes to the heart of why the government is in such a bind over Brexit. I spoke to a minister recently who said, I've got to choose between what I think is in the national interest and the party interest. And I think Theresa May, in her heart of hearts, is unsure whether she's doing the right thing in pursuing this quite hard version of Brexit that some in the Tory party are encouraging her to. And I think this goes to a wider problem, that this has got so messed up with party politics. The politicians are putting their parties and thinking about their parties rather than the voters. And meanwhile, a lot of the reasons that people voted for Brexit that actually aren't all economic reasons. They're things like public services, things like the housing crisis, issues that aren't being dealt with, and they're all being brushed under the carpet and ignored. And I think there's a real danger that Brexit sort of become party political squabble, and actually the real problems in the country aren't being dealt with.
OK, the man in the blue shirt there. Blue shirt.
When...
Which people?
Hang on. Let you speak. The man in the blue shirt, are we hearing from you? Yes, with the beard. No, it's your turn to speak,
Thank
please.
you.
Not Terry's.
Thank you. When will the hardline Remainers from the political and media elite of this country start to have some faith in this country's ability to perform on the world stage?
Okay.
People like Terry...
What, the media elite? You mean like Boris... unlike those rebels like Boris Johnson?
Shouting over people like that.
Hold on, let's just hear one person at a time and not always you, Mr.
From the media, from the left side of society, shouting over people. It's just arrogant, and it's just they have no faith in this country's ability to perform, and it's one of the world's most powerful, strong, economically, militarily. Have some faith.
Even though the pound's tanked.
We're 21 months on from the referendum, and we're not having a debate on a level that we really need to have. I think that it is really unfortunate that on the one hand we have people accusing other citizens of being swivel-eyed loons or racists, and then on the other side of the debate there's people saying that the other side are traitors. Listen, we're in this together. We are going to leave. We only have about 8 months now to start making a decision about how it is we're going to leave and what it is that we're going to do. And I have to say, I find it profoundly worrying that the Cabinet, who are the ones who are going to have to make the decisions about how we're negotiating, are only now starting to have a discussion about whether or not we should be in the customs union. I mean, for heaven's sake, this is the future of our country. Hey, I tell you what, guys, I would like to speak without you interrupting. And it's about the future of our country and the future of our children. And it does seem to me that we have to come to a deal that will work for all the regions and all the nations of our country. And this is why we need to come together and stop shouting at each other.
Yeah, fine.
All right. And let's try to finish this discussion without shouting. The woman there, or the person there in spectacles, Let's see whether a man or a woman. Yes, you.
I totally agree. I think the problem with politics at the moment is there is too much politics. There is too much ranting at each other about Brexit, about the consequences of the election as well. And I recently set up a petition about having a government of shared unity. And that is an idea of actually having party leaders coming together as a union, so not actually having the role of a Prime Minister and sorting stuff out like Brexit. Because Brexit, people don't really understand what it has meant for the country. And I think Brexit is actually England, well, Great Britain, deciding to have their own decisions about their own country and how it runs. And it's not we hate foreigners, it's we just want to make our own decision of certain aspects to benefit the country we live in. And
so what would be the first decision you'd make when we've left the EU? What the EU stopping us from deciding?
It's just every country is individual.
Germany trade with China. We can trade with who we want. That's a lie.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I cannot believe the word you're saying.
Well, but I'm telling
at the end of the
it's
day,
a lie. We can trade with who we like.
If we got a majority of 52 to 48, and we all agree that it's going to happen, and we all agree we're going to leave the EU, and we're going to leave the customs union, then forget hard, forget soft.
Yeah.
Right? We're the 5th/6th largest trading nation in the world. You telling me Europe doesn't want to trade with us? Get out of it. We need to be resolute and stand together.
Very basic. It's a very basic question from me.
I said at the beginning that none of you wanted to talk.
You know, I mean, it's a very basic.
75% of you didn't want to.
It's a very basic question for me. How do you become wealthier by leaving the richest trading bloc in the world?
Terry Christian, thank you very much.
Have a biscuit.
This is an important question. Rachel Wearmouth, let's have your question, the last 5 minutes of the programme.
100 years on, what still needs to be done to encourage more women to go into politics?
Thank you for a great question.
Right. Who'd like to start on that? Rachel, you start on this one.
I think the tone of politics is actually one of the most important things. You know, I've been covering politics now for about 20 years, and the number of women has gone up hugely in the House of Commons, and it's changed a lot. But, you know, all the talk about sexual harassment or whatever, the thing that really, I think, puts people off is seeing men shouting at each other across the dispatch box. And also the really nasty, vile stuff that particularly women MPs get on Twitter. I'm sure both Claire and Emily have had this. There are death threats. You know, I know women MPs have had to put 7 locks on their doors because they're so frightened at night. Both within parties, actually, and from outside parties. And I think the party leaders have got to be much stronger about that. And it's the tone and the nature of the political debate that's got to change.
Emily Thornbury.
I think it really helps having more women in Parliament. And I think that young girls looking at Parliament can see that there's more women around. And I hear what you say. It is tough, but I'm not a victim. I'm doing the best job in the world. I'm doing the best job in the world. And any 15-year-old girl watching television tonight, if you want to be involved in power, if you want to be involved in making decisions, there are lots of areas of the world, it just seems to me, lots of things that have been politically neglected and areas that quite often are things that women feel strongly about. We've talked about the NHS. We've talked about social care. We've talked about childcare. There are lots of things that actually I think are neglected and probably would be talked about much more if more women were involved. But anyway, even parking that, there's everything else. There's everything else. And we have as good and as strong a say as anyone else, and we need to get more women involved. And yes, I think the more women we get, the more that women will think, this is a job for me. I can do this job as well. And in the end, you don't need any political qualifications. You don't need to go to university and get a degree in being an MP or anything else. You just need to be a good, strong voice for your community and be proud and speak out and be brave and be bold. And it's a job for girls.
There's an arm up there, and I can't see who it's attached to. But anyway, with the the long sleeve there. Yes, that person, yes. It's you.
I think what a main thing is politics, it needs to appeal to younger people more, because that will be the next generation of MPs and people who work in Westminster. Because I know a lot of my friends, when I talk about it, they'll say, oh, but politics doesn't affect me, it doesn't interest me. And when actually they start to look into it, they think, oh, actually, it does affect me. And that's when they become more interested. And I think, as well, if you appeal it to them, they'll think, oh, actually, I do want to go into that. So you need to, rather than saying, oh, women, come and join us, you need to say, oh, actually, politics as a whole, come and have a look at, like, interest us. And that's when more people will join and promote women.
All right. Claire Perry.
I completely agree with Emily. And I have to say, you know, the more women get in, the more the tone changes. You saw, this is what happens all the time. Lots of people shouting about the theory of things, and actually women in general, cross-party, work together to get things done. And actually the essence of being an MP is standing up for a constituency that you love and trying to help people in it. And that's the stuff you don't write press releases about, you just do it. And I think women, frankly, do that, as well as men, very well. But I would change one thing radically. So we're about to embark at some point on restoring the Palace of Westminster, which is the cradle of democracy. It's a beautiful body. I want to do it at the minimum amount of cost for taxpayers. Why don't we have a chamber that isn't based on how far men used to have to stand to not kill each other with swords, which is where the measurement of that chamber come from? Why can't we have a more consensual setup that doesn't encourage people to yell at each other across the dispatch box? That would definitely help.
Richard Tice.
I think, you know, Emily was 110% right, you know, and it is fantastic. I was interested that you what attracts you is just power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hopefully what attracts... Well, yeah, but actually, hopefully what attracts politicians is making a difference, improving
But you can't make a difference without
lives.
power. That's the whole point. That's the whole point. Politics is about power and making decisions, and who you when you close your eyes, who are you thinking about?
But in terms of encouraging...
And how you're making those decisions and why.
Could you not shout at me so I can speak?
I'm just telling you. I get quite passionate about this.
A brief last word, and then Terry.
We have got to encourage more people into politics. We have got to do something about the abuse on social media. When we go home tonight, it will be absolutely horrendous out there in terms of the trolling.
Terry Christian.
Don't read it.
Terry Christian.
I mean, it's strange because we think that we're over it in this country, you know, the sexism in politics, and yet what is very telling is this week, the 100th anniversary of women, you know, fighting to get... women fighting to get the vote. Some women, 100 years ago, but I've heard the phrase, given the vote. They weren't given the vote, they fought for the vote. And, you know, there's still a long way to go. OK, we're on our second female Prime Minister.
Well, yeah, good.
Personally, I think we should just let the Downing Street cat do a better job, but it's great that she's got there.
OK.
But the reality is, you know, if you look around the world, there's still a long way for women to go, you know, and I was quite moved by those women in Iran, you know, doing the hijab protests. And, you know, that to me is something that we should applaud, and that is a sign of how far women have got to go in politics, not just in this country, but all around the world.
OK, we have to stop. Thank you very much. Next, the iPlayer. My thanks to our panel and to all of you who came to Darlington to take part in this edition of Question Time, and until next Thursday, good night.